In 1858, centuries of dumping raw human, animal, and industrial waste directly into the River Thames came back to haunt the City of London in the form of the Great Stink. The smell was so bad it could cause vomiting in people miles downwind, but it would also eventually lead directly to the construction of London's first modern sewer system. Today we're going to take a look at some nausea-inducing facts about London's famous Great Stink. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other European historical topics you would like to hear about. Okay, everyone, I gotta warn you, the stink is about to hit. Prior to 1858, London's primitive sewer systems, to put it mildly, were in terrible condition. Delicious raw sewage was emptied directly into cesspits, large tanks, or even just deep holes in the ground. When they filled up, they were designed to overflow into the streets via crude culverts. Oh yeah, poopy runoff. The culverts then emptied into large trenches which just ran down the street, even on major thoroughfares. And if that doesn't sound delightful enough, the waste in the pits would occasionally seep through the soil and find its way into the basements and foundations of homes. This created the risk of too much methane becoming trapped in air pockets, which could, and sometimes did, cause explosions. But some waste did actually make it all the way to the sewer system, which was a good thing. Right? Well, no, because the sewer funneled directly into the Thames River, as well as several other sources of drinking water. Yeah, they were drinking their own wastewater. This extremely disgusting situation is very likely what caused the cholera outbreaks of 1832, 1849, and 1854, in which many thousands of Londoners died. Advances in technology are often a mixed blessing. Such was the case with flush toilets, which had quickly become a luxury among cramped city dwellers who were used to going all the way to their basements to use the bathroom. However, their proliferation put an enormous new strain on an already outdated and overtaxed sewer system. Cesspits were designed to contain an average home's waste, but the new flush toilets were also pumping water into those holes. This made them more likely to flood homes, which increased the risk of various diseases. Eventually, the cesspits were connected to the city's sewer system, which, being designed to handle rainwater, emptied directly into the Thames. So you're probably wondering why Londoners decided to dump their dung into their drinking water. Good question. To be fair, they didn't realize they were doing it. Starting in the 1600s, the city funneled the excrement, as well as other delightful things like industrial waste and animal carcasses, into the Thames under the belief it would be all washed out to sea. The problem was, none of that actually happened. Part of the Thames is what's called a tideway, which means that it's an area affected by the tides. Therefore, any of the waste and sewage that was dumped into the river could be carried back or forth along its length, spreading in either direction. All of that waste built up in the river for centuries, and by 1858, the entire city of London was sitting on ground that was saturated with sewage. When the heatwave hit, it all bubbled back up to the surface. As early as 1855, the problem had started to become evident, and the famous scientist Sir Michael Faraday wrote a letter to the Times of London to call attention to the dire conditions. In the letter, he described a simple experiment he had performed to test the river's opacity. On a sunny day, he went to the river with some white paper cards. He tore up the cards and moistened them so that they would sink below the surface. Then he walked along the bank and dropped some of the paper pieces into the water at every pier he came to. Again and again, the results were the same. The paper bits became invisible before they had even sunk an inch below the surface. While performing the experiment, he also observed that in the vicinity of bridges, the human waste rolled up in clouds so dense that they were visible at the surface. Faraday noted that the stink was common to the whole river, which was basically just a giant open sewer at that point. Emphasizing that his descriptions weren't exaggerated or figurative in any way, he pleaded with the authorities to do something. By 1858, the Thames was in an utterly horrific state. There had been no meaningful changes to the sewer system in years, and a rise in the population had caused an increased amount of waste to be dumped into the river. At the same time, it was still the city's main source of drinking water. No one was really making any efforts to clean it up, and even if they had, it's not clear what might have been done short of building an entirely new sewer for the whole city. Hundreds of years of human and animal waste, garbage and industrial byproduct had turned their water thick, brown, and opaque. Only a few years earlier, Sir Michael Faraday warned Londoners that if we neglect this subject, then a hot season will give us sad proof of the folly of our carelessness. Despite his very specific warning, they would neglect the subject, and the great stink would soon prove him right. As anyone who's ever seen a disaster movie knows, ignoring the dire warnings of a panicked scientist seldom leads to anything good. In this case, it led to June of 1858, when a heat wave descended on London, and an accompanying dry spell made the Thames River nearly stop flowing. The summer heat cooked the fetid water, and the entire city was consumed by the stench. It was so overpowering that it was blamed for illnesses among the upper classes, and townsfolk miles away were reported to start vomiting whenever the wind changed in an unfavorable direction. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli described the river at the time as a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. Man, the British are really good at beautifully articulating something that smells terrible. It wasn't until the water dried up that it became apparent how much waste was really in it. It wasn't just sewage either. The river was clogged with offal, industrial waste, dead animals, street runoff, animal feces, leftover parts from slaughterhouses, rotten food, and literally centuries of putrefied garbage. The dry spell had brought it all to the top, and the heat wave had it fermenting in the sun. The people of London tried to get around town by using scented handkerchiefs and various other measures, but they weren't effective. Even Queen Victoria herself, namesake of the whole era, couldn't escape the stink. On one attempted cruise of the river, she tried to mask the stench by pressing a bouquet of fresh flowers against her nose. She only lasted a few minutes before ordering the boat to be turned around and redocked so she could get off and get as far away from the river as possible. Doctors of the Victorian era subscribed to a now debunked idea called the miasma theory. You may remember this term from our plague videos as well as our Victorian hygiene video. Check them out, they're good. The theory, which was rooted in thinking that went all the way back to the ancient world, held that diseases were caused by bad smells. It was on account of this belief that the city and the medical community focused most of their efforts on covering up the bad smells rather than cleaning the river itself. This was a mistake. For many poor people in London, the Thames was the primary and often only source of drinking water, and they kept using it no matter how bad things got. That meant huge swaths of the population were regularly exposed to bacteria that caused deadly and sweeping outbreaks of illnesses spread by contact with feces, like typhoid and cholera. These early attempts at tackling the problem by covering up the smell had other consequences. For example, at one point, authorities spent a fortune to dump chloride of lime into the river, which they hoped would do the trick. Not only didn't it work, but it wound up adding to the river's toxicity since chloride of lime is, in fact, poisonous. In something of a break for the people of London, Parliament had recently moved into their new offices at the Palace of Westminster, which sat right beside the Thames. The new location meant that for the first time, lawmakers couldn't avoid smelling the river, and it's not for a lack of trying. In fact, their first move was to attempt to cover up the stink by drenching the building's curtains in chloride of lime, but it didn't work. The body even considered relocating from their new home at the palace, but that wasn't practical or popular. Letting the poor and powerless suffer was one thing, but if lawmakers couldn't avoid smelling the river themselves, something would have to be done about it. It took just 18 days for Parliament to pass a bill funding the construction of a brand new sewer that would fix the damage done to the Thames and prevent additional pollution. Parliament placed the task of redesigning the sewers into the hands of an English civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. He delivered nothing short of one of the greatest government work projects of all time and was widely credited with saving the city. Constructing Bazalgette's entirely new sewer cost the city the modern equivalent of roughly $300 million. The system, which Bazalgette had designed 2 years prior, consisted of a network of sewers that ran parallel to the Thames River, rather than into it. The waste was carried east of the city before being emptied into the river at a point where it could easily flow out to sea. The project also included the construction of water treatment stations, embankments to prevent further buildup of waste, and the development of alternative sources of fresh water. The action was a huge success. The Thames quickly returned to a healthy condition and deaths attributable to poor water quality plummeted. In fact, the new system was so well designed and efficient, it's still in use to this very day. So what do you think? What is the worst smell you've ever encountered? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.